But I'm going to talk about running a benevolent puppet regime and what that meant while I was at ReadyTalk. So as a kid, I really liked working with systems. One day when I was mowing the yard, my parents' yard in middle school, the mower wasn't quite running right. Like it was blowing puffs of smoke or whatever. So I decided I could fix this, looked up on the internet how to fix it, started taking apart the whole lawnmower. My dad comes home and sees like all of the lawnmower parts strewn all over the garage floor. And I think the only thing I can remember him saying is like, I hope you can put that back together and it works. And then he just like walked back into the house and probably had a mini heart attack. But this relates to my job at ReadyTalk as a dev tools team lead, where I was in charge of paving a smoother road to production for all of the development teams and even the operations teams in some respects. So what is a puppet regime? When I started researching how to craft a creative title for this talk, I was like, puppet regime sounds like it could be really cool, right? So I started researching what that meant, and then I was like, how do I make it like a good spin on a puppet regime? So a puppet regime is defined as a system that is directed by an outside authority that leads to hardships on those governed. I'm going to focus on the hardships aspect of that, and then a benevolent puppet regime has a nicer spin on it, where instead of hardships, we're looking to improve operations on those governed. So those governed would be people as well as computers, right? We're not just focused on how to make computers run and operate faster. We are also interested in how people can work together, have better processes. So at ReadyTalk, I started about 4 years ago and saw the engineering team grow from about 40 engineers to 80 engineers. You should try some of these dance moves too, like mix them up. They work pretty well. No laughs? Do you need more beer? So doubling the engineering team has definitely some consequences. We also saw the amount of machines, amount of nodes, virtual or physical, grow from hundreds to thousands. And the way I had to set up my computer when I started at ReadyTalk was unique. I pretty much had to unwrap the box and set it up myself with the help of a sysadmin and his set of Perl scripts. This is how I would describe the Perl scripts, affectionately named Old Pearly. And this guy on the top is kind of the sysadmin, like tweaking the couple lines that didn't quite work. But if you notice, the people standing around, there's a lot of like, they're not even looking at this guy standing at the top. They're just kind of waiting around, I don't know, laughing about something. But not him. I would be laughing at him. So the sysadmin was really frustrated with how this process went for him, because you are essentially growing the engineering team from 40 to 80 engineers. You're doing this a lot, right? So he was pretty sad. He was considering what improvements he could make, and he thankfully saw some Reddit chatter about Puppet one day, about four or so years ago. And he was really excited about the possibilities of this system that he could use to bootstrap computers as well as maintain them after they were set up initially. So he started building modules, building that first round of system, and really liked what he saw. He actually presented this as like an internal demo, internal labs feature to the whole engineering team. Everyone got excited. But when he actually started to roll this out to engineers, developers, machines, people were not receptive to it. We heard comments like this: I'm not going to allow Puppet on my machine because it will totally destroy my handcrafted artisanal dot files. Which is not true. Like, if you're building Puppet modules, you don't care about what people have as dot files, right? Like, it doesn't matter. And then we had some people, which I think is hilarious. These people would come up over and over again, no matter what technology was being introduced. They would say like, hey, we've used this process, we've used these Perl scripts for the last 5 years. Why change what is working just fine? So 2 years ago, my team, which is a DevTools team of 3, not that big of a team in a group of 80 engineers, we wanted to figure out how to solve these problems, how to improve these difficulties from happening in the future over and over. So 2 years ago, we developed a survey where we asked a question like this: which statement best describes your ability to work on Puppet modules? This is the absolute worst answer people could have chosen. This is the best, so people could add they're pretty much self-sufficient with Puppet. What we saw is this, like 3/4 of the people answered the lowest 2 answers. So I try to avoid working on Puppet modules, and the other one was like, I sort of can read Puppet modules, which is a pretty low bar to reach. One of those people was actually one of my friends in the sysadmin infrastructure area who was like supposed to be working on Puppet modules. So that's not a good sign, right? So he was actually in this group. I can read Puppet code and generally figure out what a Puppet module is supposed to do. The survey quotes, though, we had like an open response available to people. That's where things got really amusing. Keep in mind the survey we collected, and we actually recorded who added those responses. And then we shared these publicly through the whole engineering team about 2 months later. So people had forgotten what they had said, so we took people's answers off, and then people were laughing, and then they're like, "But that was you!" So the first one is, I don't use Puppet. And then people started to get more specific about what they saw going wrong with Puppet, or what scared them about Puppet. So this person didn't even know he had access to the Git repository that held all of our Puppet modules. And then this one is poignant for sure. I feel like our Puppet modules are guarded. I am happy and able to contribute, but don't feel like there's a culture that supports this. So for me, for a person that really wants to build communities that have lots of involvement, people are interested in the things going on around them, this is crushing, right? And it's kind of like someone that just barely is looking at the things around them. Another question we asked is, what do you do when you run into issues with Puppet? This is the worst, which we kind of made humorous. We were like, no one's going to pick this. And then this is the best. I investigate and resolve the issue myself using resources outside of the company, even not just people sitting next to them. So I file a JIRA issue with steps to reproduce the problem is like 1/4 of the responses we got. And then I ask a subject matter expert for assistance. Those were kind of like in the middle of the range of responses that we wanted to see. But if you notice, this is like 2/3 of the responses we got, and they both have something to do with communicating or creating tickets for other people in the organization. So that's a lot of support requests. That's a lot of support calls, so to speak. Who has actually used one of these phones? Yes, that's awesome. I used it as like a toy and when the power went out, but that's pretty much it. Survey quotes for this section were pretty impressive too. I've never had to do anything with Puppet. When I asked for help, people ran away from me. And by far, this is my favorite response, this next one. Also, Puppet attacked and killed my family. This one, though, is where we're going to take the solutions that we started to build from. So this gives us some more direction. This was, I have no idea how to contribute or improve our internal Puppet infrastructure, even though I'm ready and willing and have actually used Puppet before in the past. So 2 years ago, we built this survey, and we started to repeat this mantra. It's not Puppet's fault or how we're using Puppet. It's not Puppet's fault, sorry. It's how we're using Puppet that's the problem. And so that's critical because you start to have people hear that, or you start to say that yourself, and you realize that like your enemy is not the tool. It's like yourself, and you have to get better at using this tool and figure out how to make it work for you instead of the other way around. So I want to take this survey spin and kind of get a handle on where you all are at with your Puppet adoption or rollout or difficulties. So I have a survey for you all, and they're kind of arranged in points. We're going to have 4 questions, and so obviously the top score would be 40. And there may be a prize for you at the end if you reach 40, which would be impressive. So just tally these things up in your head, and then I'll kind of ask who fits into certain domains. So how long does it take to set up a new machine for any engineer? Basically, out of the box to a working machine, provide it to that machine instead of like having them unwrap that box and pull out all the packing peanuts and make a mess. Everyone have kind of an idea where they stand there?
Workstation or server?
Either, actually. Let's do workstation, like someone's personal workstation.
We only have Puppet in production. How many points do I get?
You only have Puppet in production. Just set up a server, like something that's serving production load. And then how long does it take to fulfill a normal priority request from someone to install a service on every one of your machines, including production? So this one, you do fit into that one. And then the next one is a little bit interesting. It's kind of to suss out some of the differences. So if there's an emergency request to install a package, how long does it take you to do that? If those 2 answers are different, then we are very similar, because that's what we had. People would just install packages willy-nilly to get things to work. All right, so this is, I think, the last question. Who contributes to the advancement of your infrastructure via Puppet? Everyone got a good handle on all the questions. Don't need to go back, see any of them. All right, so 35 to 40, do we have anyone in that range? Okay. If we did, I would say we get to trade spots now, and you get to give the rest of the presentation, which would be awesome if someone was. Okay, 20 to 34. Nice. Some achievers. Nice. 5 to 19. Okay. And then I have a lot of respect if your hand goes up for the 0 to 4. Okay. So we're like in the average sort of range, which is cool, because that's kind of where we started and started to build from. So the first thing that we saw from the survey was people could help but can't, whether for whatever reason. There was a high barrier to entry. There was essentially a brick wall in some cases for people contributing back to our Puppet infrastructure. So I'll call that a low involvement. We're going to deal with that in a specific way. And so people who know how to maintain or advance Puppet problems are too tied up in fixing problems would be the next area that we're trying to fix. So if you remember the picture of the old phone, this was the second survey answer that we're trying to fix up here. And so people are too tied up in fixing problems, can't actually advance the Puppet infrastructure we did have. That's what I'll call a strain group. So we have low involvement, focus, improving that, and then reducing the strain on the group that is intended to improve the Puppet infrastructure. And then the third area we have is Puppet is perceived as something that gets in the way or is inconvenient. So in Denver, there's this park is pretty close to downtown. But this is called a desire path. I don't know if you've seen these. These are pretty common, especially around Portland. I was walking around and saw all these. So there's this nice sweeping sidewalk that's intended to look very pretty and slow bikers down. But people just like cut all the way through the park, right? So they put all these sweet signs that says, "Please use sidewalk, protect our parks." But everyone just like walks through that line. I think it's hilarious. They started putting police barricades around the entrance of where this arrow is now, which sort of works, but then they get moved and people still walk there, which is hilarious. So desire paths, how do we create a process that people want to adhere to, that's fun, as Deepak said, like, or someone this morning, I can't remember exactly what it was, like engineering, the Walmart guy. Engineering should be fun, like this should all be fun. So how do we do this so that Puppet development is fun? And this creates a feedback loop, like all this low involvement, having a steering group, and having a subverted process all the time creates this cycle of like pain. And so you have people that are like running in place furiously, trying just to like make sure this thing stays up and operational. So I'm a DevOps nerd, so to speak. Does anyone know who this guy is on the left here, or on the right? No one? So this is William Edwards Deming. He has produced a lot of work for the manufacturing area of like how Japanese plants really improve their processes and the and-on chords and all that stuff. So he has this quote that I think is particularly interesting to what we're going to talk about, which is, hard work will not ensure quality. Best efforts will not ensure quality. Gadgets, computers, or investment in machinery will not ensure quality. It is not enough to do your best. You must know what to do and then do your best. So how does this relate to having a Puppet regime transformed into like something that's creating hardships for people, and then creating a benevolent Puppet regime, which is improving operations? And really what it is like to realize that people and computers are both sort of involved in the problem. It's not the technology, and it's the solutions can't be focused on just like cool things that people are attracted to. It has to be like changing the way people view their daily jobs. So how do we take our Puppet game to the next level? I was thinking people would actually have beers in here, and this would be like I'd have some serious banter on stuff. But okay, this is cool. So I have three little tips or tricks or tools that I'm going to cover that should be able to take your Puppet game at your companies up to the next level. The first one I'm going to talk about is something called committing to collaboration. This is so who contributes to your Puppet infrastructure? How do we decrease that low involvement? And so committing to collaboration, at least to me, sounds really cheesy. It's like, to me, it seems like kindergarten, and we're going to play, learn, and grow together, right? We're going to get along. But you look at all the memes out there, like this one in the DevOps space, worked fine in DevOps ops problem now. And then you see like the ops side of things where it's this. So what I specifically saw at ReadyTalk was an us versus them culture, which if you see that in your company, that's like something that you should try to fix by going out to lunch with people. Making people talk to each other over food works really well. But getting rid of that is like something that you should do before you start changing any of the technology under the hood of your companies. Because us versus them cultures is so prevalent in the US for sure. And you can't have that if you're going to move very fast and break things or drive some fantastic improvements. So not only does this not belong, this us versus them culture not belong in DevOps, it doesn't belong in any company. So I'm very adamant, like get rid of that as your first thing that you do. So this quote from the survey that we gave was an us versus them quote, right? So we had some work to do. And I love these. These are like HTTP status dogs, and so each status code has been matched with a dog that kind of connects to that action. So if you see us versus them, like you need to deal with that first. Make sure anyone can get involved, and then so specifically, if you don't have a Git or a Subversion repository storing your Puppet code, that's what this commit to collaboration is intended to do. That's like your first technical step that you should get into. because then you can actually show people the code, even if they don't modify it. You have a place where they can see it, and it's not just on someone's computer, not on someone's machine. So committing to collaboration, pretty simple thing to address. We're going to start advancing in difficulty and interesting aspects here. The second tool is automating authority. So you want to make sure that you can have people being able to install services through the accepted path through Puppet, including production. Workstations could be developers or production boxes. Because if people are providing things into your Puppet infrastructure, then you start to reduce the strain on the group that was like in charge and the blessed group. So the group becomes more of like a gatekeeper and saying, hey, like, well, yeah, that seems like a cool addition. Do you want to do a pull request? How you want to add that? Like, do you want to pair on this? How can we like help you get that change into infrastructure instead of saying, I will deal with that ticket later, maybe in a year. So this is a video. I have some audio to this too, so if you want to get that all set up. This video will queue up what I think of automating authority, maybe. So notice this lady, like, she's really stoked about her job, but like there's a lot of furious movement, but people are just like going the way they probably would have gone even with her not being there. Pretty sweet moves though. Like, you burn in lots of calories there. Nice, okay. So when I saw this video, I'm like, isn't there, like, there's already a stoplight above that intersection. Like, what is going on that this lady is out there in the first place? And automating authority would be like, how do you build stoplights into your infrastructure so that you can have all those processes automated instead of like being out there yourself and being the gatekeeper of like, no, you can do this, but you can't do this, that kind of thing. So one of my coworkers really likes Ronald Reagan, and so he is always saying like, we should build our systems to trust people but verify their changes. So automating authority for us looked like we would take all the code in our Puppet modules, Jenkins would pull all those changes, and then use some technologies like Kitchen CI. I don't know, is anyone familiar with Kitchen here? So there was a Beaker talk earlier in this room and might have been in other talks too. Kitchen CI is actually comes from the chef world, but it's just a nice interface on top of Vagrant. So if you've used Vagrant before to like spin up a test box with Puppet, it provides some cool things, which I'll explain shortly. So Kitchen CI creates VMware or VirtualBox VMs for you via Vagrant, and then does a Puppet run, just does a Puppet apply on those boxes and applies either a set of modules or just one module, and then uses this thing called server spec, which is kind of like a behavior-driven development for infrastructure language to say, is this box configured the way that I want it to be configured? So this seems like, well, Puppet is already kind of like the language is a desired state system language. Like you're declaring what you want to see on that box. So why do I have to do this testing? You'd be surprised how many times like you have conflicting packages. Just like configuring infrastructure is way harder than you'd expect, and having your own little sandbox when you're creating modules or debugging modules is so helpful in the future. So even if you're like, this module is so simple, in the future it may be a godsend for you to be able to like spin up something, see why it got into that certain state, and then add some Puppet code to make sure it doesn't get into that state again. So this is a Kitchen CI YAML file. I won't go into too much detail, but the idea is you're running Puppet applies on a specific platform, and you can have various amounts of platforms. You can have Debian, you can have Ubuntu, you can have Red Hat. So you can start to do matrix testing of like, hey, does my module actually work on all of the variants of operating systems that we have in our infrastructure? And then you can kind of mix and match which, it's called suites, but it's essentially mapping to one module. So you can mix and match exactly like how you want everything in this YAML file to work together to provision you a box that then you can investigate with server spec. So like I said, platforms, you can specify one or many, and you start to get like parallel testing ability. And then Puppet apply, pretty obvious, like you can just map all these things to your individual repositories. And then running, let's say, a Postgres suite, which I'll talk about here. So this is server spec. Kind of looks very Ruby-esque with a list of packages that then you can expect to be installed. Looks very Cucumber-y if you've ever played with Cucumber. And then we ran all this stuff in Jenkins so that it was highly visible. We actually put the results of this Jenkins job on a big dashboard that people could see, which you'll actually see later what that dashboard looked like. And the interesting thing is, if you remember that coworker that I mentioned, like didn't actually contribute to Puppet development, he was the one that built that Postgres module testing and all that stuff. So just by like kind of dangling this carrot in front of him, he was like the #1 proponent to improving Puppet infrastructure, getting awesome tests behind it. And he would tell everyone about this ease of testing that Puppet gave him, just like he would get in a language. So this definitely reduced the strain on the group by automating authority. If you have not checked out Beaker, that's like the blessed Puppet Labs way of doing these sorts of integration tests. And if you have situations where you need multiple virtual machines in a cluster, maybe you want to test like what it looks like to have a Puppet master and then a bunch of nodes, but all those nodes are talking to each other, like maybe an HA MySQL setup or an HA free switch setup. Oscar can handle that, which is amazing to be able to have like cluster tests being spun up in virtual machine sort of ways. So this definitely helped us have other people install services, configure servers, configure their OS level dependencies of the applications that they were creating. Now the third tool that I'm going to show you, which is my absolute favorite thing that I did with Puppet, was rebuilding ruthlessly. So how long does it take to set up a new machine for every engineer? This rebuilding ruthlessly is intended on improving people's responses to that and what it felt like to like set up a machine if you were a new employee at ReadyTalk. So this reduced the strain of our Puppet management group for sure, and then also made sure that people were staying on the sidewalk. So this also helped us make sure that people were installing services through Puppet and not going on machines and installing them manually. So every developer had sudo access to pretty much every machine. So if something wasn't working, specifically on build slaves, it would maybe work on half the build slaves, but not on all of them. So those would be people kind of tampering with machines when it's an emergency, like my build has to pass by the end of the day. I'm just gonna install these packages on the machine. One of my favorite quotes of like what I saw happening at ReadyTalk in terms of like how we were managing our machines at the time was from Futurama. And so Kif says, "Captain, may I have a word with you?" And Zap Brannigan says, "No. It's an emergency, sir." Zap Brannigan says, "Come back when it's a catastrophe." And then you hear this loud rumbling sound. And then Zap Brannigan's like, "Okay, well, fine. I actually now care about the problem." So our build slaves were special snowflakes because everyone could mess with them. Snow is pretty awesome. Like, it's cool. I live in Colorado. It's kind of sparkly when it starts to snow. But then you start to get more and more snow, and you have situations like this, where this is actually a 60-foot tall wall of snow in Japan. And that's kind of what it feels like when I hear people say, like, we have snowflake machines. I'm like, oh, they're so pretty. But then eventually you have like snowflakes upon snowflakes, and then eventually there are avalanches, right? So what we're going to do is rebuild ruthlessly, apply that concept the same way that people mitigate avalanches. So this is a howitzer. They just kind of shoot it at mountainsides and just take out like loose snow and make sure that avalanches are controlled and happen at a time that they want to happen. So we have Jenkins. Jenkins Master has the nice hat there. And we have a bunch of slaves. And we're going to take 2 of those out, let's say per day, rebuild them from scratch automatically and not do anything manual to do that. So as most Jenkins setups are, they're like, all the slaves are old workstations that have been kind of scrapped and no one cares about, and the Dell warranties are up on them. So you're like, well, let's just run some builds on them. And you stuff them in a room. And this room is so hot. This room is like 90 degrees to 100 degrees. And you're like, if it's cold one day in the office, I know where I'm going, just laying across all these machines. So we're actually going to take down, rebuild these bare metal machines from scratch, which is an interesting challenge. It's not as easy as just taking a virtual machine out and rebuilding it. So these are the technologies that I used to build this process. We had Jenkins involved to kick off and show you the process and what was going on. And then Ansible was kind of like this agentless system that was able to inspect various parts of your infrastructure, of ReadyTalk's infrastructure, and then kick off Foreman or Puppet runs depending on what was happening. So I'll show you exactly what that process looks like. Obviously, you have a Jenkins master communicating with a Jenkins node. And then Ansible actually talks to Jenkins and says, hey, are there any builds running on this box? And if there were, it would wait until there were no builds running, and it'd take that machine offline, but still finish those jobs. And then it would talk to Foreman and say, I'm going to restart this box. I want you to Pixie boot it when it comes back on the network. So at that point, in the Pixie boot process, Puppet would actually run the first time after the Preseed, during the Preseed part of the Debian installation. And so Puppet was kind of rebuilding everything from the nuts part. We had maybe just a minimal set of things in our Preseed file, and Puppet was doing most of the rest. Ansible looks like this, a lot of YAML again. So the build slave serial 2 shows that we're going to do 2 at a time, and we set it up so that it would only do 2 per night, actually. And this is an Ansible task. If you're interested in what Ansible looks like, this is a local action. So grabbing the Jenkins CLI jar and being able to execute commands on it. That's how we put Jenkins slaves offline and made sure that the slave was idle. Then we initiated the Foreman build. Keep in mind, we were not a Puppet Enterprise customer, so Foreman was our replacement for the Puppet Enterprise setup. So if you're in a similar situation or like an open source project that doesn't have much funding, Foreman, it can do a lot of the same things that Puppet Enterprise can do, and you just have to kind of wire these things up yourself. And then after you restart the server, verify that it's actually dead, and then you wait for the server to come back alive. So Ansible is waiting maybe 30 to 45 minutes for that machine to come back on, just because of the Puppet run and all the packages that were being installed. So our slaves had the ability to run any build that people wanted to build. It wasn't like there was a slave per project or team. So there were a lot of packages that we were installing. And then we would launch the Jenkins slave and make sure it was back in the cluster to serve builds. This you may not be able to see, but that's fine. You can kind of see this is the beginning of the process where just by kicking off this slave manager job and picking the slaves that were in our cluster, like you could pick whatever ones you want or all of them manually, and this would get run every night. And you can see there's like a mixed success rate on this job, which I'll get into why it was mixed and what that meant to us. So it would start doing all those actions I mentioned before, and then we're now at the state where we're making sure everything is dead and then waiting for servers to come back online. So at this point, the servers are being destroyed, and these two are in slightly different places. The one on the left is doing a Puppet run, and the one on the right is kind of getting started to do that Puppet run, which is the Preseed. We hooked it up so the Preseed operation of the Debian installer would run Puppet the first time around, which was nice if you have like LDAP, because then on the first boot of the system, you would have LDAP already set up, and then you could install users, configure users on the second boot. So at the end, you would have something that looked like this. You would launch Jenkins slaves. And then put them back in the cluster. That's what I mean by put Jenkins slaves online. And then I talked about the dashboard we had in a pretty visible location. It was on like a big display. This slave manager job, when it would go red, then we would know that we had something wrong with like our entire Puppet infrastructure, which is a good way of seeing like, is your day gonna suck today or not? So by rebuilding ruthlessly, we get rid of that string group, and you have this consistent idea of, is our Puppet infrastructure operating the way we expect? Is it doing the things that we want it to? It's not being tested when it's being demanded to be used. It's like being tested on a daily or more than daily basis. And then it also rebuilt these Jenkins slaves so that if people were installing packages, that's fine. They can still have sudo on those boxes. But Puppet is really good about like managing what you tell it to manage, not managing like stuff that you haven't told it about. So getting rid of like any packages or any weird configurations that you didn't even know were possible on those boxes are difficult. But by rebuilding all these things from scratch, you kind of have this build slave cluster that is eventually consistent and not having all these manual tampers. The other interesting thing that we saw is we found lots of problems in our Debian installer Preseed process. Like people were committing things that didn't work so well. We had problems with our apt proxy. We had problems with our initial Puppet run that wouldn't show up on existing long-lived machines. And we had people say, like, I rebuilt my whole workstation, my entire development environment today by myself without any problems. And then one day, this job went red on our dashboard, and I was like, this is weird. Like it can't start to configure the Jenkins user. This is weird. So I send all these results over to the sysadmin, and he sent me back an email that said, like, when I realized what was happening, I had a small heart attack. So what was happening was SSD had come down in like our entire office and in all of our data centers, and the only reason that our infrastructure was still up was because LDAP credentials, LDAP users were being cached everywhere. So within 24 hours, things would have started falling over, right? This is bad news. Obviously, best solution would be like, why aren't we monitoring this? But it was a new piece of our infrastructure that we had introduced maybe within the last 2 weeks. And so we weren't well versed in how the system could fail. So this was kind of like showing us early warning signs of new pieces of infrastructure that were maybe we weren't used to, and were failing in weird ways. And so these new machines that were rebuilt obviously didn't have that cache, and so we had problems with. He said, "You have saved me a huge headache tomorrow," and he actually brought me muffins, which is awesome, like my favorite muffins. They're like caloric as heck, but they're awesome. So if you rebuild ruthlessly, it's exciting to be able to destroy and recreate your infrastructure and be at home and asleep during that time. So by doing all three of these things, let me just speed through here because I'm running out of time. So we had lots of people working hard, but not actually gaining any traction. And then once we started to introduce this idea of a benevolent puppet regime, people and computers started to work well together. We started to see high involvement. People that were puppet haters became people that were building puppet modules themselves, like without any help. We had a high performant team. We had like this dashboard that showed people how, like, the status of our infrastructure, the things that we had built. And then we had this rewarding process, people that wanted to get involved. It was exciting to be able to talk about, like, hey, we were rebuilding bare metal machines from scratch every night with pretty good success. So that makes me a happy individual. By committing to collaboration, automating authority, and rebuilding ruthlessly, we definitely had a smoother road to production for our development teams and our operations teams. So this is also a blog post if you want to read it, if you want to follow up with any details. I gave this in Denver in March. And then also tweet at me or contact me through my website if you have any more questions. And I have like a couple minutes to answer one in person too. Yeah, go for it.
Very good presentation. There we go. Did you ever get a chance to rebuild that lawnmower?
So
I've been
interesting.
wondering that the entire time.
Yeah. Oh man, sorry. I didn't mean to leave that like cliffhanger. Possibly for a year until we're back again. Yes. So the lawnmower operated the same as before I took it. Like, it actually ran after I took it apart. But then I shortly thereafter replaced it with a different lawnmower. It had been my dad's since he was in high school, so it's time to be pushed behind the garbage can and killed. Yeah, what other questions? You're all just like, let us leave.